We have a wonderful all-star panel here. If you plan to sleep, you won't be able to sleep because I am expecting an intense discussion. So I'm gonna try to set the stage before we start our conversation. This panel is about slowdown in emerging market economies. So the slowdown in emerging market economies, this latest episode started in 2010. And this graph shows you how that slowdown has evolved. 2010 growth was around 8%. You come to 2015, it's below 4%. And 2016 is not going to be that different. What is important is that growth now is lower than what these economies delivered over a longer time period from 1990 to 2008. You might say, is this about China's slowdown? The answer is no. If you basically look at countries other than China, emerging market economies, they are slowing as well. Frontier market economies like Kazakhstan, they have been going through the same slowdown. This is quite interesting because it's taking place in an environment. Advanced economies slowly but gradually have been putting higher growth rates. Their growth rate is quite low, but while advanced economies, in a sense, gradually picking up momentum, emerging market economies have been slowing down. Now, per capita growth slowdown has been even more pronounced when you look at the numbers. In fact, frontier market economies per capita growth pretty much stopped in 2015. Now, what's the big problem here? Ultimately, you need growth to catch up, get to the levels of incomes of advanced economies. When growth slows down in these economies, the differential in growth between emerging markets and advanced economies is slowing down. In fact, in 2015, that difference, the growth gap between emerging market and advanced economies, came down to a level which has been the lowest for over past 15 years. Of course, another important observation, these economies are much larger and they are much more integrated within themselves, emerging market economies. The fact that Brazil is in recession, Russia is in recession, South Africa is slowing but at a very low rate, and China is deliberately slowing down, and India is putting up respectable growth numbers, is quite worrisome. Why? These countries together constitute a large fraction of emerging market universe, and the slowdown in this group creates significant adverse spillovers to other emerging market economies. For example, when these large emerging market economies, BRICS, collectively slow down by 1 percentage point, that type of slowdown shaves off 0.8 percentage points growth in other emerging markets. A significant share of that, of course, slowdown is attributable to China. Now, so this session is going to put the slowdown in context and hopefully try to answer this question. Where are emerging market economies going? So now, as I mentioned, we have an all-star session from academia. We have policymakers, ex-policymakers, as well as representative from a think tank. Now, I'm going to start with Daron Acemoğlu. He's professor of economics at MIT. He does not need an introduction. And I'm going to ask him a very straightforward question. Do emerging market economies need a growth reset? And how can they deliver that growth reset?
Thank you, Ayhan, and thanks everybody for being here in our session. It's a great pleasure to be here. And the answer is yes, they need a growth reset. But what type of growth reset? So simplifying things, we can put an umbrella structure for the growth model of pretty much all of the emerging markets, whether they are frontier, BRICS, natural resource producer or not. And I would say that it essentially is built on a sort of a dual structure. Many of these economies, we can see this in Astana in Kazakhstan, but you can see it in any capital around the world, have a very modern sector with corporations that look very similar to their European or American counterparts. They are immersed in the world markets, technology, and all of that. And they even have some institutions such as courts that might look very similar to what you would encounter in London or Paris. But behind this sort of inclusive modern facade, there's also a large extractive body. What I mean by that is that the rest of the economy does not really build on technology, innovation, productivity growth, producing niche products, does not mobilize the resources of the entire society in the form of creating opportunities for the vast majority of the people, incentives for them to take part in the in the productive economy. And it is supported by a political structure that doesn't give people voice, that doesn't mobilize the civil society. This dual structure works reasonably well during good times. It works well because you have the natural resource prices increasing, technology imports coming, integration into the world economy, but it is really hiding a lot of the sins of this dual structure. The extractive part not only lives on corruption, rent-seeking, clientelistic policies that instead of listening to the true wishes of the people, citizens, tries to give them handouts to sort of pacify them, but it also really lets a lot of the resources and the capacity of the society remain unused. There could be hundreds of millions of people around the world in emerging markets who have amazing talents, but they could never realize them because they don't go to proper schools. Even if they go to some school, they don't get high quality education. Even if they get high quality education, all future paths of advancement in high-tech sectors and high value-added sectors are closed to them. They can't even become proper citizens because they don't have voice through civil society organizations or democratic processes. And this system, because of this dual structure, because it doesn't generate this productivity growth, is also highly unstable. So it leads to these stop-go cycles. So the sins are hidden during good times, but they come across much more blatantly during bad times when you see the corruption becoming a barrier to economic growth. And during such times, as of now, there are often sort of calls for doing something. What are we going to replace this old model with? And the most natural thing is replace the old model with old model version 2. So you put Band-Aid on the problems. You try to do a few reforms. You privatize a few things. You undertake a few structural reforms, but you leave this heavy dual structure fed by the extractive element of it largely unchanged. Why do you do that? You do that because the people on the top of the business world, on top of the political world, those who are with the bureaucratic power in these societies don't really have an incentive to change things. You do that because true change is really difficult. Institutions are highly persistent. They are highly persistent because when you try to change them, they resist. When you try to change them, they explode and something bad comes instead of the previous bad one. And also, if you really want to go beyond this old model, you need to have a strong dynamic comparative advantage in some high value added sector. You need to have the human capital to feed that new growth process. And many of these economies only generate human capital for a small fraction of the society, and those go into the bureaucratic sector or into these modern firms that are, really providing very cushy jobs, but the new entrepreneurial blood is often not there. So what can we do? Well, I think what we should be thinking about are revolutionary reforms. A new model which really requires a total change of focus. Why did I use the word revolutionary reforms? Because I think the reforms that are necessary are truly radical, but they are reforms. I think many of these dual structures are unstable, but that instability is a two-edged sword. In many of these developing societies, we see that when there is really the reforms are not forthcoming, the instability is much more severe. So I think reforming the system from the inside is often a more feasible path, except that the political will for doing that, meaning that the insiders with the power actually wanting to do that, is the real barrier. But if it were feasible, I think it will go through a couple of main pillars. First of all, in many of these societies, you have the core of an institutional structure, but if you look at it a little bit more deeply, you see that state capacity is highly missing. By state capacity, I mean the ability of the state to enforce laws, to provide public goods, to adjudicate conflicts, to provide security. In many of the emerging markets, you have a little bit of that, often concentrated in the capital or in some of the other major metropolitan areas, but the rest of the country, under vast parts of the country in Latin America, in parts of Asia, in Turkey, in Africa, are totally outside the power of the government, because the state does not have that capacity. You need to create a legal system that has independence from whoever is controlling the government, so that it can really start enforcing laws in an even-handed manner, so that this level playing field that is really necessary for the inclusive growth, for people to be able to participate in that growth process, should really be able to do that. You need to have a institutional structure such that growth is going to come from a bottom-up process. This doesn't mean that the government's not going to play any role. The government has to play a very important role in every economy, from regulation to public good provision to technological support in some instances, and some of these needs are even more pronounced in developing economies. But it is of utmost importance that the relationship between business and government is of arm's length. When you look at many emerging economies, the real sort of stifling factor is that governments and state institutions and business are too close, which means that sort of radical, creative destruction type innovations are much more difficult, because there's a natural conservatives coming in, and also there is a bias for the larger corporations that have always done business with the government. So that needs to sort of change. A third pillar of that, which is related, is that we need to embrace a little bit of instability. Stability is very important, especially political stability, but instability in the business realm is very important. If you look at many developing economies, there's a real fear of investment projects, which are often sort of launched as national pride items, failing. But you can never have a market economy that's going to be innovative, that's going to try to produce niche products, that is not subject to either the creative destruction, which means the new replaces the old, so makes the old fail, or the new tries something new and itself fails. So that failure needs to be part of the business culture, and again, that requires not just an institutional reform, but a general reorientation of the growth process. And then fourth, you need the bottom-up process to go beyond the economic realm. You need the civil society to become more active and more involved, not just in economic affairs, but overall social and political affairs. And that's even a harder step, because many of these dual structures have been supported by a top-down political system. All of these are revolutionary in some sense, but there are revolutionary reforms, because you don't want that to be resolved necessarily in the streets. You want that enough demand for change to come from the bottom up, that reasonable policymakers start making room for those sorts of revolutionary reforms. Is that easy? I think it's very difficult, but I think a very important first step is diagnosing the problem. I think part of the reason why we keep replacing the old model with old model version 2, old model version 3, old model version 4, is because we don't diagnose the problem correctly. We think that we can just band-aid the underlying issues with a few structural reforms, with a little bit of central bank independence here, with a little bit of privatization here, but really the need is one for a much more holistic institutional overhaul of this growth model. Thank you.
thank you, Doran. That was a strong start. Let me turn to Jeff Sachs. He's the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And he knows a little bit about these revolutionary reforms because he worked on these shock therapy reforms in the 90s. So, Jeff, how do you see the slowdown in emerging markets, and what is the best remedy for these emerging markets? Do you think that the kind of Daron's case for these revolutionary reforms immediately needed, or there is a case to be made for a kind of incremental approach?
Thanks a lot. It's an interesting discussion and topic. I will just put my wager on continued convergence. I think that's the basic trend that we're on. I don't think that there's anything to overread in 2 or 3 years of data. We went through a big financial crisis. Nobody has figured out in the whole history of modern capitalism how to keep the financial sector from eating itself alive every 20 years or so. And the 2008 financial crisis was a big crisis, started in Wall Street with all those wonderful institutions, and created havoc around the world, and we're still seeing some of the legacy of that. But broadly speaking, I think the most important phenomena taking place in the world are two. One is the continued rise of China as the world's largest economy, and that is a huge factor for this country and for Central Asia, for the whole world. And second is the continuing technological dynamism of information technology, and I think that that will continue both to disrupt markets and it will continue to generate economic progress, because what information technology can manage across almost every sector of the economy is very, very strong. So my view is that we're still in an era, as long as we keep peace and a more or less open international system, we're still in an era where we're going to have economic growth, relative convergence, because I think the information technology is really a very big friend of developing countries because it's low cost, easily transferable, hugely powerful. And so I would think that that's going to be a continued engine of growth. Of course, it is also true that in order to take advantage of circumstances like this, you need a strategy, and you need institutions that work pretty well. And those can be quite different from simple market institutions. One of the most important things for this country will be the quality of the education system. That's really a big, big challenge, because when you look at current indicators, for instance, the OECD comparative measures of education performance for the 80 countries or so that are part of the PISA project, Kazakhstan's near the bottom of that. And that's in science, math, and reading, and that would give me a lot of pause, and would be an area where I would want to invest quite heavily in information technology, higher standards for teachers, higher pay for teachers, emphasizing improvements in education. I think also for this country to benefit from China's rise, this One Belt, One Road framework that China is investing in is extraordinarily important, because Kazakhstan's right in the middle between Western Europe and China, and that can be a difficult position, but it can also be a very important constructive position from an economic development and strategic point of view. So I think that the basics are always true, that in order to achieve growth, one has to be able to master the continued improvements of technology. That requires skills. It requires enough stability in institutions to be able to do that. It requires a government sector that can invest significantly in infrastructure. It generally requires a good neighborhood, meaning that you're at peace with the neighbors and also with open economic relations with the neighbors. It also requires good luck. Kazakhstan is being hit by two crises right now. One is the oil crisis, and second is the Russia-Europe tensions, which are very bad and have a bad spillover for this region as well. And so there are geopolitical tensions that are very, very significant. And I think, Doron is absolutely right when it comes to horrendous cases of corruption, of which I would put Brazil and South Africa as two examples, where things can get so out of hand that the government loses all sense of what it's actually doing, because Brazil really became a completely corrupted class almost everywhere through Petrobras, and it's paying a heavy cost for that. So that's also true. But we know that you don't need purity, in fact, to have economic results, whether one would like it or not. There's always a bit of a mess in economics. It's never a pure textbook case of pure standards. But growth can be pretty robust, and I would expect it to be. I just think we're living through one more transition that we're living through, just to keep in mind, obviously, is, and it's a major one for this country and for some of the others that have slowed down, we're living through a process of decarbonization of the energy system that's just starting, and that is going to mean that the simplest growth model for this country, which is more oil, is not going to be a viable model. And I think that that is a long-term reality, not likely to turn around just by a rebound of commodities prices. The global climate challenges are serious and real enough to make it unlikely that we're going to go through another hydrocarbon boom as we might have expected 5 or 10 years ago. And that does mean that for Kazakhstan, finding different bases of integration in the world economy is extremely important. And the new Silk Road, the One Belt, One Road integration, which promises a two-way integration between East Asia and Western Europe, I think is the best hope.
Thank you, Jeff. So, Jeff nicely articulated these external and domestic challenges emerging market economies facing. There's external challenges, China's slowdown, but at the same time, China's initiatives around the world, kind of domestic challenges, education, institution building. When economists, academics, as well as people like me in international organizations talk about reforms, it's always, easier said than done. We are very lucky we have Ivan Miklos here. He was Deputy Prime Minister of Slovakia, as well as Minister of Finance at some point. Now, he is president of an economic think tank. So, Ivan, how easy to undertake these reforms, and what is the big challenge for emerging market economies? How these economies can generate the type of growth they need to catch up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me. I will just add that now, at present, I'm serving as Chief Economic Advisor of Ukrainian Prime Minister, which means it is another challenge if you are speaking about doing reforms. Yeah, I very agree what Professor Asemoglu said, that, and I'm usually using not the revolutionary reforms, I'm using, but it is the same. I'm using comprehensive, deep and complex reforms, because if not, if governments are doing only partial reforms, then usually costs are coming, but the results are not. And very important, in my opinion, is that we have to speak not only about macroeconomic stabilization, sound and sustainable public finance and structural reforms, but also about institutional reforms. And this is what I think was mentioned here. And if speaking about progress, I think, yeah, very important is if convergence process continues or not. And I think we have very nice experience, an example. As you know, in May 1st, 2004, 8 post-communist countries, very homogeneous countries, entered the European Union. If you look at their development and their convergence progress, for instance, from 2003 until now, we see that despite of very strong similarities, legacy, institutional legacy, structure of economy legacy, convergence results are very, very different, surprisingly very different. Measuring by convergence progress as how quickly they are approaching the EU average in GDP per capita, in purchase parity power, if you look at these countries, we see two groups of the countries. More successful countries, more successful convergence countries are Poland, Slovakia, and 3 Baltic countries, and less successful are Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovenia. And figures are really important difference. For instance, between 2003 and 2014, which means including last years, which in general was slowed down economic growth, average convergence progress in these 5 more reform countries, 3 Baltic, Poland, and Slovakia, was 22.2%. In average, every of these countries in average approached EU average level by more than 22%. But in Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovenia, it was only 4.7%. If you look at the 2 countries, Slovakia and Hungary, for instance, if you look for the short-term period between 2003 2008, it was golden time. At that time, and I think Slovakia could be interesting because we did exactly at that time, in 2003, we did really revolutionary reforms. We prepared during 2003 and imposed launched from 2004, tax reform, public finance reform, fiscal decentralization, pension reform, social reform, labor market reform, healthcare reform. Really comprehensive package of reforms. Then we achieved really jump. In between 2003 and 2008, Slovakian convergence progress was 17%. Hungarian was 1%, just 1%. And of course, you can say, okay, this was golden time, it was global boom, but I'm convinced that now, in more difficult times, it is even more important and not less important if these kind of reforms are done or if not. Which means I very agree that necessary precondition for successful convergence progress is deep, comprehensive, revolutionary package of macroeconomic stabilization measures, structural reforms, and institutional reforms. Easier to say than to do, because what is the biggest problem is that reforms are much more political than technical problem. From technical point of view, we know what to do, but of course from political, this political problem, because everywhere in the world, people don't like changes. There is risk aversion, which is normal behavior. And then what is, in my opinion, the most important, you need strong leadership, political leadership. You need ownership of reforms, and you need also very strong communication. And if you are looking at the successful countries, we see that these preconditions have been fulfilled. And it means that we need, because what is the biggest threat for the reforms, for the necessary progress, not only in emerging markets, everywhere, is populism. Growing threat of populism, threat of protectionist, isolationism, Which means in this regard, it is necessary to have politicians who will do this despite of difficulty, despite of political risk connected with this. I remember when we discussed, when I was finance minister in 2002, 2006, we discussed many times in ECOFIN meetings. It was at the time a Lisbon strategy in the mid-time. Lisbon strategy, if you remember, said that Europe wants to catch up US until 2010. Then it was clear in 2005 that is not going on, and we discussed why. And then at that time, Jean-Claude Juncker said, he was at the time Prime Minister of Luxembourg and Finance Minister as well, and he said, of course, we all know what is necessary to do. What we don't know, how to win elections after doing this. But I think this is not true, this is a mistake, because there are examples from Baltic countries, from Slovakia as well, that after doing these kind of reforms, if they are really done such revolutionary, because if reforms are sufficiently complex, deep and comprehensive, and if you are starting with them at the beginning of election period, then it is chance that they will bring results, and it is chance that it will be not political suicide for those who are doing them. Let me mention a few words about Ukraine, how I see situation in Ukraine from this point of view. I think Ukraine did during last 2 years after Maidan much more than 20 plus years before. But on the other side, it was not done enough. It is a lot of what is necessary to do. And again, the biggest problem is not strong enough leadership, ownership, and communication of reforms. If I speak about leadership, you know what I mean. If I speak about ownership, I mean that politicians have to be convinced deeply that they have to have vision, will, and courage to do, and to be convinced that they are doing reforms, not because IMF is pushing, because financial markets are pushing, because European Union is pushing. Because the worst example of absence of the ownership of reform is Greece, Greek government. And communication means that politicians have to communicate, have to use every possibility and opportunity to communicate, but also to communicate by fighting against populists, because this is the biggest threat. If you are speaking about today's Ukraine, the biggest threat is even bigger, I think, than Russian aggression, is growing influence of populists. And if there is insufficient leadership, ownership, and communication of reforms, then it is a real threat that populists will stop reforms. Which means this is, in my opinion, important in every country, not only in emerging countries, but especially if we are speaking about commodity export countries. It is even more important to do these reforms because the situation changed in the market, and we can see the worst example how to deal with this is Venezuela. Also, very bad example is Russia. Kazakhstan has chance. If I heard Minister Bishimbayev, what he said in previous session, what they are planning to do. If these reforms, including privatization, including improving business environment, institutional reforms, will be done, then I think Kazakhstan has a chance to succeed and to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ivan. So, reforms by themselves, of course, not sufficient. There has to be substantial ownership of these reforms and push them through. So we talked about Central Europe quite a bit, Ukraine including. Now we are very lucky because we have a veteran central banker, Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Mexico, Javier Guzman, with us. Javier, how do you see the slowdown in emerging market economies, and what's the perspective from Latin America and Mexico?
First of all, I want to say that I am very honored to participate in this panel with such a distinguished group. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if we'll have the chance to take a look at it. If not, okay, here it is. Well, I agree with many of the things that have been said by previous speakers. I will try to be as as less repetitive as possible. First, very fast, a few figures. Before the financial crisis, we had a remarkable performance of emerging market economies. If you take a look at the rate of economic growth, for instance, during the period 2000 to 2007, we had nearly 7% on average. Of course, this allowed emerging market economies to increase significantly the share that they have in global output. If you measure that in PPP adjusted terms, you will see that the share of these economies in global output rose from around 40% in 2000 to more or less 50% by 2007. This, of course, resulted in an increase in the well-being of the population of these economies, measured on the basis of nominal GDP per capita, also adjusted in PPP terms. You will see that there was an increase of nearly 70% in that period. After the global financial crisis, emerging market economies showed great resilience. However, a short period after that, they began a deceleration of economic activity. And this is worrisome because it has been persistent and it has been generalized across countries and regions. Of course, understanding the reasons behind this deceleration of growth in emerging market economies is fundamental to see what the recommendation is. External factors, of course, have played a decisive role here. We have heard a lot about the deceleration of economic activity and in production and potential growth in advanced economies, the deterioration in terms of trade, of emerging market economies, the tightening of external financial conditions, the decline in the volume of trade, and so on. However, from my point of view, the main challenge for emerging market economies nowadays is of a domestic nature. And why am I saying this? Well, first of all, there are recent empirical estimates of the determinants of growth in emerging market economies, the IMF, the World Bank, and they suggest that in the most recent period, it is internal factors, and especially a slowing down of total factor productivity growth that is determining the evolution of growth in emerging market economies. Secondly, there are demographic trends that are going to affect the performance of emerging market economies in coming years. In particular, what we are seeing since 2010 is a deceleration in the rate of growth of the working age population in these countries. And third, we are seeing a change in the external environment for emerging market economies, which is not of a cyclical nature. It is a structural transformation of external environment for these countries. And this, of course, has very important implications for economic policy in these economies. What are these factors? Well, we see, to start with, that the possibility of a substantial recovery of the world economy is still out of sight. In this respect, it is important to note that the potential rate of growth in advanced economies has declined. We have even seen some discussion about the possibility of secular stagnation in these countries. But irrespective of whether this is a reasonable possibility or not, it is clear that will be a long time before we see rates of growth in the advanced economies at rates similar to those that we saw before the global financial crisis. Second, we have the problems in China. We had a lot of discussion on this morning. There is a transition which is reducing the rate of growth and the rate of potential growth in China. In this context, it is not surprising that what the IMF is projecting is a deterioration of the terms of trade of emerging market economies until 2021. And we have an additional problem, which is the normalization of monetary policy in the US, and in general, the situation of uncertainty that we are seeing in international financial markets. What is this suggesting? That external financial conditions for emerging market economies are going to remain difficult for a significant period of time. To sum up, with the nature of the recent deceleration of growth in emerging market economies, and with the structural transformation of the external environment that these countries will be facing, it is clear that they need to strengthen the domestic sources of growth, and this is clearly a challenge of a domestic nature. What should emerging market economies do to meet this objective? Well, what you see here is nothing very new. It looks very simple. It is not simple at all. First of all, macroeconomic stability. There is no need to elaborate on this. There is, I think, universal agreement on the importance of macroeconomic stability. The only thing I would like to say here is that there is a big difference between theory and practice. Implementation has proved to be a very difficult issue. In fact, we continue to see in a number of emerging market economies high fiscal deficits, high current account deficits, high levels of debt, and so on. And if you take a look at the sources of the deceleration of economic activity in emerging market economies in recent years, you will see that one of the factors is precisely macroeconomic stability, or the lack of macroeconomic stability. Second, financial stability. This is a more complicated issue. The standard recommendation nowadays is use macroprudential policies, and whenever this is feasible, complement them with coordinated efforts on the macroeconomic and the microprudential sides. However, despite all the energy that has been devoted by the international community to understand better how to achieve financial stability, we have still many theoretical and empirical gaps here. And then finally, structural reform. I think there is no doubt, there has been a lot of discussion about this, about the need to take action on the supply side. And this is, of course, underlined by the importance of the decline in productivity growth in recent years, in the deceleration of growth in emerging market economies, but also because of the risk that these countries face of falling into the so-called middle income trap. That is to say, the stage where they have reached an income level where the underutilization of resources and the easy productivity gains have been, are diluting. On the other hand, an element that has also been mentioned is in recent years, we have seen only a few emerging market economies implementing comprehensive packages of structural reform. Part of that is explained by the rates of growth that they observed during the period before the global financial crisis. This led indeed to some complacency. The situation, of course, has to change if emerging market economies want to continue to grow at reasonable rates. Is it possible to make recommendations of a generalized nature for these countries? Of course, that is not possible. It all depends on the particular characteristics of each economy. But I think that on the basis of the international experience, and I would add also on the basis of the experience of Mexico, we can underline a number of principles of a general nature. And what are these? You will see a lot of coincidence with what has been said already. You have to reduce barriers to the efficient functioning of markets, fuel competition, fuel innovation and the adoption of new technologies, the accumulation of physical and human capital, and so on. Institutional reform should take a very important role in any process of structural reform. Third, it is important to recognize that there are synergies between reforms in different areas. Fourth, it is important also to take into consideration that the sequencing of reforms is very important. And in this case, I would say we in Mexico have had a very negative experience with an inappropriate sequencing of reforms in the early 90s. Fifth, it is also important to take into consideration, in this respect, I would like to quote again the middle income trap hypothesis, that the drivers of productivity growth may vary depending on the level of development of each economy. And finally, it is also important to take into consideration that approval of reforms may take a long time. The implementation of reforms may also take a long time. The impact on productivity will also normally be slow. There may be some effects of structural reforms that will be seen more rapidly, but in general, the effect on productivity will be slow. And therefore, it is important, very important, to move in this direction very rapidly. I don't know if I have the time to make a couple of comments about the Mexican economy. If not, I will leave them for afterwards. Okay. Well, Mexico began a major effort of structural reform in late 2012. As I mentioned before, the full effect of these reforms is going to take a long time. In fact, they are still under implementation. But what I want to underline now is that there are some effects of these reforms that are already evident. The first one has to do with the impact, the implication of reforms for inflation in Mexico. Take a look at the left-hand side of this chart. What we see is the red line is the rate of inflation in Mexico. The rate of inflation in Mexico, we have an inflation target of 3%. The rate of inflation in Mexico has been below the target for 12 consecutive months. This is an unprecedented achievement in Mexico. What are the reasons behind this? A combination of factors. The most important one among them, a solid macroeconomic framework. But there has also been a role for structural reforms. The right-hand side of this chart. Take a look at the prices of telecommunications, the blue line, or the prices of electricity. And these declines in the prices of these products are related basically to reform of the telecommunication sector, which has focused on increasing competition in this sector in the Mexican economy. And the second one, the case of electricity, is partly related to the reform of the energy sector in Mexico. A final comment, the rate of economic growth. In this chart, what I do is I compare the rate of economic growth in Mexico and in other countries in the years before and after the global financial crisis. As you can see, in the case of Mexico, the rate of economic growth remains stable. Let me clarify, at a rate of growth that's still insufficient for Mexico's needs, but the fact is that it remains stable. And this is notwithstanding a situation in which the rate of growth of our main trading partner declines, as you can see in the second part of the chart on the left, the US. And despite the fact that during that period we were affected by a number of external shocks. But if I compare the evolution in these two periods, before and after the global financial crisis, in Mexico and in other emerging market economies, you will see that Mexico is one of the few countries in which the rate of economic growth does not decline between the two periods. Again, it is very difficult to separate the impact of different factors determining this behavior. But there is clearly a possibility that the resilience of the Mexican economy to the external shocks, to the deceleration of economic activity in the US, is related to structural reform. And with this, I end. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. So, structural reforms are not just helping improve growth, but at the same time making the economy resilient. And Javier made a case, in the case of Mexico, this could be the one benefit of structural reforms. Javier also talked about middle income trap. It's a very popular topic. When I visit countries, people ask me about it. And we have Eric Berkloff here. Eric used to be the chief economist of the EBRD. Now he's the director of the Institute of Global Affairs at London School of Economics. Eric, how do you see the slowdown in emerging markets, and how should we think about this middle income trap question in the context of this recent slowdown?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So I think there's no doubt, when I travel in emerging markets now, this is the dominant paradigm. You go to China, you go to India, you go to Turkey, everywhere, it's the same notion, this middle income trap. And it's somewhat surprising perhaps, because a lot of the academic literature over the last few years at least have basically shown, or at least suggested, that this idea that countries would get stuck at some particular level of income doesn't really hold out in the data. And it also seems rather implausible that countries that are so different in terms of structure would, at some particular level of income, end up in trouble. So that's, what, and this idea that you countries get stuck is on the face of it not so easy to establish. Yet, this transition from middle income to high income is clear, and some of the previous speakers have mentioned this. You need a change of both institutions and a change of economic structure. And of course, this structural transformation is a very important part where the both sides of this, both institutions and structure need to change together through an interplay. And what we see is that countries that grow fast as low income also tend to grow fast as middle income. And so I think one should look at what are the abilities of different economies or different economic systems to make this transformation, to have a successful interplay between institutional change and structural change in the economy. And when I look at what countries have been successful and what countries have been less successful, I think there are a few things that stand out. It's really about building in kind of transformational pressures, but also abilities of institutions to transform themselves. And so, give you an example of and I think this transformation is particularly difficult for a country like Kazakhstan, which is rich in resources. A few years ago, we looked at in the EBRD region the countries with the worst institutions and the countries with the best institutions. And actually, the single most important factor was openness, and this was both trade openness and financial openness. And this even after you had controlled for EU accession and EU membership. So already there, I think there is something that is key to getting this kind of transformational capacity of an economy. But it's also absolutely critical that you, inside the economy as such, have these changes. So it's about competition, it's about establishing governance rules, transparency, getting the political system to work and build institutions that are more inclusive, that are politically reflecting what the voters or the constituencies want. If you look at then what is it that you want these economies to do? Well, as we said earlier, what you need to do at the level of an emerging economy when you are away from the frontier, the world technology frontier, you need to think a little bit differently about innovation. Of course, you want innovation in the sense of innovating completely new things, but really what's much more important is to have transfer of technologies, and both for imitation and adaptation. And that takes somewhat different capacities of the economy. It's about so secondary education, maybe first years of college education is more important when you are thinking about imitation and adaptation. And what Jeff Sachs spoke about, the problem of the quality of education, at least according to the PISA studies in Kazakhstan, is one example of something that needs to be addressed if you should have more absorption of technologies in Kazakhstan. So both for middle-income countries that to move towards the frontier, it of course needs over time to build capacity to genuinely innovate and have a supportive R&D policy, have competition, have a regulation that enforces transparency in the economy. So there's a whole range of issues to drive productivity that are, quite different for emerging economies than for advanced economies. So, and of course, Daron spoke about this dual structure that you see so prominently in many emerging economies. And of course, that's another aspect of that is these very long tails of inefficient firms. And so you need to, again, it's about finding pressures inside that push these companies out of the economy, and does it in a way that is also takes care of sort of socially allowing people to transfer to other sector, other jobs. Yes, one last thing that I think is particularly striking when you come to Kazakhstan is the lack of medium-sized firms. So you have fair amount of small firms, so you have some very large firms, but you have almost no middle-sized firms. And given that the experience is that it's really most of the productivity improvements come in small firms growing into middle income and then maybe growing even bigger. And that's where a lot of the growth really has come from in advanced economies. And so you need to build that capacity of small firms. Small firms will fail more often, but the small firms that succeed, they are the ones who really drive productivity in the economy. So that's finding ways of promoting that is absolutely key. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. With that, I'm going to open the floor for discussion. We have half an hour. Questions to panelists? Please. Do we have a microphone here?
Во-первых, поблагодарить за столь дискуссию интересную. Мне хотелось бы сказать, что Казахстан не Венесуэла, Казахстан не Греция. Казахстан – страна, которая провела уже достаточно много либеральных реформ. У нас очень либеральный рынок труда. Недавно принят новый закон о занятости, новый трудовой кодекс, в котором очень учтены права работодателей. У нас либеральная пенсионная система. У нас накопительный пенсионный фонд, и люди копят пенсию сами. Ну, сейчас переходный период, то есть какая-то часть идет из бюджета. У нас очень высокий частный сектор, у нас очень либеральная налоговая система в рамках, скажем, стран бывшего Советского Союза. У нас самые низкие ставки налоговые. И, безусловно, все это способствовало тому, чтобы экономика все-таки была рыночной, но издержки нефтяной экономики всем известны. Мы жили слишком хорошо, мы слишком жили незаслуженно где-то хорошо, наверное. Сейчас мы получили макроэкономический шок, и главная задача, как нам выйти теперь из этой ситуации. Мы буквально небольшое экспресс-исследование провели для того, чтобы понять, а кто сейчас выживает, кто развивается. Мы взяли два критерия. У кого есть рост производства в 2015 и первый квартал 2016 года, и у кого одновременно растет производительность труда. И мы обнаружили эти отрасли, их немного. Это отрасли обрабатывающей промышленности, пищевая промышленность, металлургическая промышленность, производство готовых металлических, неметаллических изделий. То есть есть какие-то ростки даже вот в этой сложной ситуации. У меня такой вопрос, мне хотелось бы сказать, что действительно, вот ключевая мысль, которую сказал господин Джеффри Сакс, для меня, это надо искать новые пути интеграции в мировую экономику. Слишком мал внутренний рынок, который насыщает вот эти предприятия, которые хорошо выжили. Как вы видите, господин Сакс, вот каким путем интегрироваться теперь в мировую экономику вот в условиях уже, когда нет нефтяных доходов, низкая цена на нефть, все-таки как выходить теперь, какие отрасли будут иметь конкурентные преимущества. Спасибо.
Thank you. So the first question is, Kazakhstan, while being an oil-dependent economy, has been quite successful undertaking certain reforms. The labor market reforms, the tax reforms have been undertaken. But then the question is, what are the new ways of integrating to the global economy? It's a question to Jeff, but I would like to see whether we have more questions. Let's try to get, yes, please.
Thank you. Dmitry Godunov, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, Geneva. Very short question. In my organization, I am a regional focal point for so-called Group D countries, which are called economies in transition, which includes Kazakhstan, Slovakia, Ukraine, and so. Question is, what will happen with this concept in the future? Because these countries are asking me, so are we still in transition, like 25 years or more? If you're in transition hall, eventually you should arrive somewhere. Yeah, thank you.
So, we have one more question.
Фамилия моя Байзаков. Я профессору Джеймсу Сакс написал в прошлом году письмо относительно как раз оценки производительности труда. Мы раньше производительность считали по валовой продукции в советское время. После трансформации мы начали считать по. Теперь мы считаем по ВВП, по вашей книге, по макроэкономике. И дефлятор считаем, и номинальный ВВП, и реальный ВВП. Оказывается, Пикетти писал недавно, что и инфляция, и реальный ВВП считается неправильно. Вот профессор Алпспаева задает вопрос, считает производительность труда. Как вы считаете, правильнее будет считать производительность труда? По какому критерию?
Excellent. If we have learned nothing today, we learn one thing. When you get letters, you need to write responses. So, Jeff, let's start with the last question. What is the best way of, or the right way of estimating productivity? Of course, your textbook was a guide, but has that changed?
Hard questions. I think the only two things I would say about productivity measurement is first, we measure lots of things worse and worse in our economy because the whole service sector is very poorly measured. And all of the uses of information technology lead to very difficult measurements of actual output. So I'm not sure that we really understand even what we're measuring when we're measuring GDP anymore, or lots of the sectors of the economy. That's one basic issue I think you're asking. The second point, obviously, is to measure not just labor productivity, but some kind of more inclusive total factor productivity, so that you get a better measurement, especially in capital-intensive economies, of what's happening. But the fact is, in almost all economies right now, we have a very serious challenge of our standard measurements not keeping up with the real nature of output, especially as it becomes less and less material and more digital. So I think there are general measurement issues. If I could say something about the other two questions very briefly. My point about Kazakhstan's integration into the world economy is that the rise of China is fundamental for Kazakhstan's economic future in two ways. One is that you have a huge market now that on your neighborhood that was not a huge market 20 years ago. And so China is a transformation for the reality of this country in a very fundamental way. The second aspect of China's rise is that China is intent on building the infrastructure linkages with Europe, the so-called One Belt, One Road network, both the overland route, which is through Kazakhstan, at least the northern corridor, and the ocean routes through Southeast Asia. And I think this is very important for this country as well, for all of Central Asia, because if there is a high quality, high speed freight, passenger rail, and other infrastructure integration, that's going to open a lot of economic activity for this country as well in a very wide range of industries. So to my mind, this new Silk Road or One Belt proposal of China to build a major infrastructure program between Europe and East Asia is really probably the most significant single factor for Kazakhstan's future economically, because you're a landlocked country between two large economic units, and if those connections are improved in transport, logistics, connectivity, power, that is the underpinning of all manner of economic integration. And so I think that that is quite a fundamental point. It means, not to miss your specific question, that there will be many sectors where Kazakhstan is going to be able to have international competitiveness. Certainly a lot of industrial sectors, commodity-based, mineral-based to be sure, advanced machinery, and you'll be exporting services also if this linkage is strengthened, because the idea of having a regional financial market here is also a realistic idea if there is a stronger economic integration than there was before. My own view is that your own market or just the immediate neighborhood of the Eurasian community is not a big enough market. So if it's Russia and your immediate neighbors, that's not enough. You really do want to trade with China and other countries of East Asia and with Europe, and to have a transport and logistics and financial and fiber connectivity to allow you to do that in an effective way. But I think it's going to happen. I think that this is going to be highly beneficial. On the question of transition economy, I would end the term myself. I was there when the term was first created. I think the first day. I think it's got to be over. We're a quarter century on, and now we have normal structural problems of countries in a region from Central Europe through Central Asia. So it's not transition problems, in my view, anymore. It's just economic problems.
On this. because I never used transition in my presentation. I think what the transition concept emphasized was the institutional change, and I think we now have a term that is better captures what you want, is what I use, the structural transformation. Having said that, if you look at, for example, the use of transition today, it's mostly used in the political sense. So, you know, the Arab transition, the political transition in Africa and so on. I think in that sense, it is very valuable to remind us that this is both political and economic transformation. And I'm not at all saying that we should not stop using transition, but I think it is important to remember that this is also a critical aspect of the transformation.
So, Daron, how should we think about this process of integration of emerging market economies to the rest of the world? And how can the process of integration augment capacity of the state, if that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase a Mexican saying, you know, Kazakhstan is too far from God and too near to China and Russia. So obviously the integration issue is important. But I think, you know, I would like to think of integration as not, you know, an unconditional process. It really does depend on how you are integrating, what your underlying institutional structure is, and what you're trying to achieve. You know, if you look at history, some of the most globally integrated economies of the world were the plantation colonies of, you know, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados. And it's actually pretty hard to imagine that they would have been able to have 80% of their population work as chattel slaves producing sugar if they weren't globally integrated. So obviously that's not the global integration that we want. It's an extreme case, but it brings the point of, you know, it really depends on how you're designing your institutions and what is the international interactions, financial, technological, and product market are bringing to the country. So I think the global integration that many resource-based economies have undergone over the last 50 years have not been very productive, both in terms of building high value-added sectors, nor have they brought an institutional or private sector dynamic that has been good for institutional development. I think the trap is to repeat exactly the same thing for many of the new resource-based economies of the 21st century, and the biggest sort of barrier to that, or the biggest sort of way out of that, is what Jeff also emphasized, which is technological. So today it's not possible to be integrated into the world economy in any shape or form without also being technologically integrated. You know, there are, of course, ways in which governments can try to sort of manipulate that. You know, China is a master of that. Iran was very successful at that, especially during the Green Revolution days. But I think ultimately that technological sort of integration does bring information, does mobilize parts of the media or civil society, and perhaps it's a partial insurance against the worst sort of global integration. But I think, again, the Chinese example shows that it's only a partial insurance and the process is very slow, and there are other repressive or other means of controlling civil society. I think also that technological convergence is a much more complicated object in this current technological environment. It is absolutely true that, you know, one optimistic view is, you know, get globally integrated, and that will bring technologies, and technologies will always cause convergence. But I think the easy path to convergence through technological catch-up has also been closed for many economies, many emerging economies, Kazakhstan probably included. You know, how did the classic technological convergence go? Well, you started in low value-added, labor-intensive sectors, and you produced those and you exported them. That way you developed both in private sector, some know-how, some global sort of expertise. But today, you know, there is China, which is very effective in monopolizing because of low cost and relatively high productivity, or many of these low cost, low value added sectors. They're now kind of taking over a lot of the medium value added sectors. Second, the process of automation and robotics has only just started transforming many of these sectors, and it's going to be harder and harder for countries to sort of contribute to their economic growth by trying to take these sectors away, because they're not going to be taking them away from expensive European or American labor. They're going to try to take them away from robots, and that's going to be harder and harder. So I think that again means that we have to think in a more nuanced way about technological sort of integration also. So all of that to say is, yes, I think the future is one of global integration, but global integration comes in very different shades and colors, and we have to be careful which one we choose. And again, the natural sort of inclination of a political system might not always be the one that serves the long-term interests of a society.
We have time for more questions. Yes, Christoph.
Yeah, my name is Christoph Rosenberg. I'm with the IMF. I want to get back to something that Eric said at the very beginning, at the end of his statement. He made this statement that small firms drive productivity gains. And I wonder if that is really always true. We did some research at the IMF just recently in our fiscal monitor where we didn't quite find this, and where we actually found that it's the innovative, the startups that are really the ones that are driving productivity, and that there's a real danger if one focuses one's tax regimes and the credit support schemes around this, this SME mantra, that one actually may, be wasting resources, and that could be used more targeted. Maybe you have a thought on that.
So I didn't say that SMEs. I said that SMEs that grow to become medium-sized and then larger, that's where most of the productivity gains come from, or the most productive firms. I agree completely that there has been way too much emphasis on promotion of SMEs as such. I think where I think there's a real need, particularly in this country, is to encourage small firms to grow large, or take away those barriers that come. And I remember in Russia we did a long time ago now, but it was when they implemented their SME programs, it was very clear that up to a level of sort of 17, 18 employees, you were sort of fine, but then you were discovered by all these bureaucrats and whatever fire inspections or licensing and so on started to bite. So, and of course you get more interesting as a corruption target if you grow a little bit bigger. So I think it's those kind of institutional constraints and maybe lack of institutional support that I was talking about.
Thank you. So let me turn to Ivan and ask his views about this transition. Where are we in the transition? And should we call it transition anyway, since you basically transformed?
Yeah, I have nothing against this term. At least in countries which still don't have functioning market economy with proper institutions, which means this is kind of transition from especially if you're speaking about former central planned communist economies to the normally functioning market economy. But I think even more important distinction is between what, for instance, World Economic Forum is dividing the countries, and I think most of the emerging economies are so-called efficiency-driven economies by this definition. And then if they reach about $17,000 or $19,000 per capita, they're calling them innovative-driven economies, which means advanced economies. And this is something I think, and this is exactly connected with the middle-income trap. How to overcome this trap, and this is then importance of education, knowledge economy, and everything connected with this is growing much more. Which means if we are looking at former transition or former post-communist countries, I think we can see that some of them reached successfully or overcome this transition period, and now they are normally functioning market economy, some of them advanced economy, innovation-driven economies. But still, of course, there are some differences if we compare it with, for instance, Western European countries. But speaking about countries like Kazakhstan or Ukraine, I very agree that very important will be openness and interconnection. And if you are speaking about global competition, this is also very often question, especially to me in Ukraine, for instance, is that what about priorities? Because Slovakia is well known that we are #1 in the world by producing cars per capita. Even 2 years from now, when Land Rover Jaguar will start production, we will produce 2 times more per capita than second country, which is Czech Republic. And everybody is surprised in Ukraine if I'm arguing that we didn't have any specific policy, that we didn't choose when we did reforms that we want to be #1 in the producing cars. No, we did reforms. We improved general business environment. We did structural institutional reforms. And then, because we had this comparative advantage in mass industrial production, despite we didn't produce. During communism, in Slovakia was not produced personal cars, which means, but we had tradition in machinery, heavy machinery, and which means it was kind of not explicit decision of the government, which means I'm trying to argue that don't do this, don't create some favorite branches or areas in which to speeding up this transition or this development. As much as reforms as possible, and then these comparative advantages will be used if country will be open and integrated to the global economy.
Thank you. I'm gonna give the last word to Javier and ask his views in the context of integration, given that Mexico is very much integrated to the North American economic space through NAFTA, as well as the global economy. How should a country like Mexico think about integration going forward?
Well, in the case of Mexico, integration to the rest of the world has been extremely important for economic development. I would say, to start with, Mexico was an economy which was very closed until the mid-80s. Nowadays, Mexico is one of the most open economies among emerging market economies, both on the trade and on the financial sides. And we have positive at the end, but different experiences in both respects. In the case of the trade opening, it began by joining the GATT, and then culminated with the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement and with the signing of a number of additional free trade agreements. I think that has been one of the most fundamental institutional changes in the Mexican economy in recent years. You have to take into consideration, in the early 80s, Mexican exports were dominated by oil. Oil accounted for more than 80% of Mexican exports. As the economy began to be open, a process of stimulus to the growth of manufacturing exports began, and nowadays they are the overwhelming majority of exports in Mexico. So the opening on the trade side in the case of Mexico has been fundamental to develop a competitive export sector. And on the other hand, of course, it has also been of a lot of benefit for consumers in general. In the case of the opening of the financial account, I was mentioning before that the sequencing of reforms is very important, and in the case of Mexico, we had a negative experience in that respect in the 1990s, in the early 1990s. And why was that? because the capital account was open in a context in which the banking system and the supervision of the banking system were still not strong enough. And the result of that was a substantial increase in inflows in a context in which we have a fragile banking system which was not sufficiently well supervised. And that was one of the reasons for the crisis, the macroeconomic crisis and the crisis in the banking system that we had in the 90s. So one of the lessons there is that you have to be very careful when you embark in a process of structural reform in the sequencing of the reforms. I have to say that after that experience, the opening of the capital account in Mexico has been very positive. In fact, one of the main reasons for the development of the Mexican financial system is precisely the opening of the capital account. So at the end, the experience has been positive, but you have to be very careful.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to provide a quick summary before we conclude. When we teach growth, in principal classes, we talk about these 4 I's of growth. The first one is initial conditions. Where you start matters. If you start at a low base, you can basically deliver higher growth rate, but eventually you converge to, you know, the kind of the growth rates you see around the world, the advanced countries' growth rates, hopefully. The second important thing, you need to invest. Investment in human capital, investment in physical capital, infrastructure, quite important, and I think that a number of panelists emphasize that. The third one, innovation. You need to find a way to innovate, improve productivity, and become competitive, especially in a highly integrated global economy. Finally, you need to basically have strong institutions. There are different ways of thinking about that. Daron made a very nice case and emphasized the importance of revolutionary reforms to increase state capacity to build institutions. And Ivan talked about the importance of ownership of reforms. I think we can all agree that this underlying slowdown in emerging market economies is a formidable challenge, and we need all of these tools together, innovation, investment, and institution building, and we hope that policymakers are listening and they will undertake the measures necessary. I would like to thank this all-star panels. It was a wonderful discussion, very informative. Thank you very much.